Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Devex event at COP26. I'm here with Saleemul Huq, who's director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development, based out of Dhaka. Mr. Huq is one of the most vocal advocates for climate justice, and this, believe it or not, is his 26th COP, so we're really lucky to have him with us today. Saleemul, if I could begin by asking you, as this is your 26th COP, what are some of the biggest changes that you observed in that time? And are you more optimistic now than you were 26 years ago about climate justice and the climate change process?
Well, the biggest change over the last 26 COPs, which has been more than 26 years, is that climate change has arrived already. This COP, the 26th COP, is the first COP of this new era of loss and damage from human induced climate change. And so the issue is orders of magnitude more important now than it was for the last 25 years. And that's because we failed to do the things we were supposed to do in the last 25 years.
Do you think it's beneficial that this has become such a big, almost Davos style event?
Well, I wouldn't compare it to Davos at all. Davos is a meeting of rich people in the mountains of Switzerland. This is a meeting of every government on the planet. It's the nearest thing we have to global government. And these governments came together many years ago and signed a treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that governs what happens at these annual COPs. They're meetings of governments to review progress on what they were supposed to do, what they said they would do, whether they're doing enough or they need to do more, of governments. And then the rest of us who are not governments, we are just here as observers and hangers on. The important part are governments talking to each other to solve global problems which only governments can solve.
Some people have compared this particular COP run by the UK, where there are lots of rich business people coming in and lots of special interests as well, as almost a sort of a two-track kind of process with the announcements and the other meetings on one side, and then the actual UNFCCC negotiations going on the other side. Does that sound like a fair characterization to you?
It's a fair characterization of every COP. Every COP is a multiplicity of events. As I just mentioned, the core purpose of the meeting is for 200 governments to come together over 2 weeks, the first week being at a technical level, the second week being at a political level, to review progress of the Framework Convention and now of the Paris Agreement, which we achieved in COP21 back in 2015, and to make progress along those lines amongst the governments. That maybe numbers a few thousand people, government delegates. And then we have many, many more thousands. I hear we have really 30,000 people in Glasgow who are not here for the negotiations. They're here to do many different things. The Greta Thunberg's on the street demonstrating. The business people are in the five-star hotels meeting and wining and dining. The academics and researchers are in the universities in Caledonian and Strathclyde having meetings on the research and the science. And all the venues around Glasgow, in and around Glasgow, are taken up by different groups, indigenous groups, youth groups, women's groups. They're all here to network, to work together, to strategize, to take actions together. So it's a multiplicity of things happening in the same city at the same time, the core business being governments talking to each other.
You've said before that COP isn't fit for purpose. Maybe you could clarify what you meant by that, if it was just the government side, the negotiation side of things, and why you think that is.
Well, what we have had so far is an annual meeting once a year at the end of the year, November, December, called the COP, the Conference of Parties. It's a 2-week-long meeting of governments. Now, as I've said earlier, this year, 2021, we are already seeing climate change. We're no longer planning, anticipating, preparing. We are going to have to deal with it. And that's happening every single day, not once a year, every single day as we speak. And so we need a system of dealing with the problem that is commensurate with the problem. And the vulnerable countries have made that demand here in Glasgow. They were here, the leader of the vulnerable countries, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh. And they have asked for a Glasgow emergency pact, calling it an emergency, which means once a year is not good enough. Every day we're going to have to do stuff and talk about doing stuff and tackle the problem and monitor who's doing what. Not just come once a year to talk about it anymore. That's the sense in which I said it's no longer fit for purpose. So once a year meeting is no longer good enough.
What sort of things would you like to see?
Every single day, every country, every government, every company, every NGO, every organization that is signing up to do actions. We have these big campaigns on road to zero, race to resilience. Everybody's signing up to something, but are they doing anything? So let's hear them tell us what they're doing every day. We want a report from somebody every day on what they're doing, and then we can collate those and look at those. And then once a year, we can review progress and see who's doing what and who's doing enough, who's not doing enough, and who's greenwashing.
You said before that this common phrase, people who are climate vulnerable, you've said you actually like to refer to these people as first adapters. Could you explain a little bit more to us about that?
Sure. So I've been working for the last more than 2 decades on helping the most vulnerable communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I used to refer to them as the most vulnerable frontline communities. But now that we are seeing climate change happen, and climate change is happening, these communities are having to deal with it already now and to adapt to it. So they're no longer preparing to adapt, they are adapting. And as they adapt, they're learning how to adapt. They actually have a lot of knowledge and experience. And we, the outsiders, can learn from them. So I now call them the first adapters, and particularly the local level adapters. And incidentally, they're not just in poor countries, they're happening in rich countries as well, even in the United States, even in Europe, even in the UK. There are local communities who are being affected by the impacts of climate change and who are taking actions and learning what to do. So we are preparing a network of these local adapters. We call it Gobeshona. It's a Bangla word for research, where we try and link up these local adapters from around the world and learn from each other.
Could you give me some examples of what this first adaptation looks like, maybe perhaps from Bangladesh?
Sure. So in Bangladesh right now, we have a very large number of people in the tens of millions living on a very, very low level near the sea in the low-lying coast. And these people are suffering, on the one hand, for drinking water during the dry season. The salinity has come into the water and they have to drink saline water. So if you and I were to visit, you would actually taste salt in the water that they have to drink. A normal human body can absorb that, but some can't, particularly pregnant women. They suffer from hypertension that leads to preeclampsia, and this has been well documented. So now, in thousands and hundreds of thousands, and even in the millions, the people in those areas are putting rainwater harvesting tanks on their rooftops. They capture rainwater during the monsoon, and then they use that for drinking during the dry season, which is a couple of months. And that's just one example of people doing it themselves. Similarly, farmers in that area who grew traditional varieties of rice, now those varieties can't survive the salinity in the water. So they use saline-tolerant varieties which have been produced by our plant scientists. We have some very good rice research plant breeders, and they've released a number of varieties of salt-tolerant varieties of rice, which the farmers pay for. They're more expensive than traditional varieties, but they survive, so they can afford to pay for them. And now millions of farmers in millions of hectares are growing salt-tolerant varieties of rice. These are just a couple of examples of many, many different things that are happening in Bangladesh.
Do you think NGOs, particularly in the global north, need to get a bit better at listening to and interacting with these first adapters, particularly in Bangladesh and other places in the global south?
Well, when it comes to adapting to the impacts of climate change, I would say that Bangladesh is probably ahead of any other country, whether it's in the global south or in the global north, because we've been dealing with this for longer. We've been figuring out what to do, and we've been trying and testing many, many different things. So the knowledge we are gaining particularly on local level adaptation, is applicable and usable by other countries. First, South-South, other developing countries. We're doing a lot of South-South knowledge exchange. That's what my center does in Bangladesh. But then even South to North, even the rich countries can learn from us. And so this is an area of global knowledge where the rich can actually learn from the poor.
Do you see the COP as kind of essential to building that process?
the COP has a very big role to play in that. In fact, as I mentioned, the COP is not just government negotiators negotiating inside a few rooms. There are many, many different side events going on here within the Blue Zone and even outside the Blue Zone in Glasgow, where different groups are meeting and sharing knowledge and information. There's a very interesting pavilion of the IPCC where the scientists are presenting their work. Every country has a pavilion where they're presenting their work. Bangladesh has a pavilion where they're presenting the work that they're doing. So the knowledge sharing, knowledge exchange function of the COP is a very, very valuable function. But that's not what the negotiators are here for. That's what the rest of us are here for.
So you've mentioned Bangladesh. Can you name any other countries you kind of think of as climate leaders and perhaps maybe organizations as well?
Sure. So in the climate vulnerable arena, the least developed countries as a group and the climate vulnerable forum countries as a group are well organized to share their knowledge and information. In addition to Bangladesh, I would name Bhutan. Bhutan is currently leading the LDC group. They are way ahead of any other country in terms of particularly the forests and emission reductions. They have negative emission reductions. They actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with their trees. And then there are other countries like Kenya and Uganda in Africa, the Gambia in West Africa. There are a whole host of vulnerable countries who have not been sitting idle for the last 10 years. They've been doing stuff, learning stuff on drought resistance, on flood resistance, on cyclone resistance. We are learning, we're sharing with each other. And we can also share and learn from the developed countries as well. You know, knowledge has no boundaries. It can move in all directions.
So we've spoken a little bit about adaptation. One of the big themes of this COP is, of course, loss and damage, and I think this is something particularly close to your heart. Could you outline for us how much progress you think there has or has not been over the past week, and is that going to be enough going forwards?
So the issue of loss and damage has already been acknowledged. It was acknowledged in Warsaw in COP19, where we set up the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. That's done some very good work over the years. Last COP, COP25, when we were in Madrid, we had the occasion to review progress, and the vulnerable countries asked for two things. They wanted a technical wing, a body to support technical assistance and knowledge on loss and damage, because it's a complicated issue. We need to know what to do. But at the same time, they also asked for funding. Now, at the end of the COP, and this issue went till the very end into extra time, we got the first, something called the Santiago Network was named. It wasn't fleshed out, but it was named that we would have it. But we didn't get the second, nothing on money. The Santiago Network is now being elaborated here over the last few days. Negotiators have been going into the fine print of what it'll do, how it'll work, where it'll be. And day before yesterday, they went up to midnight on the wording. I understand they do have wording. So the Santiago Network looks like a done deal here in Glasgow. That's a good outcome. But it's still a technical outcome. It's about learning, knowledge, research, sharing information, not about doing anything about loss and damage. On the finance, we haven't gotten anywhere yet, but we are still pushing. We've got a few days left. We'll see what happens at the end. One interesting thing that has happened outside the COP is that our host government, which is Scotland, in addition to the United Kingdom, the First Minister of Scotland has actually put £1 million on the table to start a loss and damage fund and challenged other leaders to match it. Now, Scotland isn't a party to the convention, so they're not here negotiating, but they are a host country and they have a budget of their own and they put some money on the table. So we're hoping that might spark some interest in matching it.
What's been really encouraging for you so far at this COP, aside from what you've just mentioned?
What encourages me at this COP and all COPs is meeting lots and lots of very interesting people, some old friends, meeting old friends, making new friends, and the energy that I find with the non-negotiators, the observers, the people that I mix with, that I belong to. The negotiations are extremely tedious, dry, and uninteresting, and in the end, we hope something will come out, but they have a long history of disappointing us.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for your time, Saleemul Huq, and thank you very much for watching. Do stay with us as we continue to cover COP26 with Devex.